The morning Mara was expelled from Thornwood Pack, the sky was the color of a bruise that hadn't finished forming yet, that particular shade of purple and gray that exists only in the hour before dawn when the world hasn't decided what kind of day it wants to be. She was 16 years old, standing at the boundary stones with a canvas pack on her back that contained 3 changes of clothing, a hunting knife her mother had left behind before disappearing into whatever silence had claimed her, a small journal with half its pages already filled with observations about plants and animals that none of her packmates had ever found interesting, and 4 days' worth of dried meat that Elder Voss had pressed into her hands with an expression that might have been pity if his eyes had held any warmth at all. The rest of the pack stood behind her in a loose semicircle, not quite watching and not quite looking away, occupying that particular social territory of people who want to witness a consequence without being seen to enjoy it. Alpha Harkin stood at their center with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression she had come to understand meant that his decision was already calcified beyond any possibility of revision, that the words he was about to speak were not a verdict being delivered so much as an epitaph being read over something he had already buried. He told her that the pack could not carry weight that did not pull. He told her that 6 years was more than enough time for a wolf's nature to declare itself, that the absence of declaration was itself a declaration, that Thornwood did not survive 3 centuries in these mountains by feeding mouths that could not contribute to the collective strength. He told her the forest beyond the boundary stones was her territory now, said it in the tone of a man offering a gift he knew was a punishment, and then he turned his back on her because turning his back was the formal gesture of severance, the symbolic act that said, "You are no longer of us. You are no longer seen by us. You have ceased to exist within the architecture of our recognition." One by one, the others turned too. Not all of them wanted to. She saw Petra, who had shared a room with her for 4 years, hesitate with her shoulders tight and her hands pressed flat against her thighs, and then turn anyway because the alternative was a courage she hadn't yet grown into. She saw the younger children who didn't fully understand what was happening look to their parents for cues and find only the same turned backs, and so turn their own small ones in imitation. Mara stood at the boundary stones for a long moment after the last back had turned, not because she was waiting for someone to change their mind, but because her legs had temporarily forgotten how to initiate movement, because the body has its own processing speeds that don't always match the mind's insistence that it's fine, that it has accepted the thing, that it is ready to move forward. Then her legs remembered. She stepped across the boundary stones and walked into the forest and didn't look back, because she had enough dignity left for that one thing, that single refusal to look, and she spent it like a last coin. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be told that the most fundamental part of your nature simply doesn't exist, that the thing every person around you has and you somehow lack, that the absence of this thing makes you not quite a whole person in the only community you've ever known, then you understand something of what Mara carried with her into Ashvale Forest that morning. And if you've never wondered that, stay with this story, because Mara is going to show you something about absence and presence and the extraordinary things that grow in the spaces between what we're told we are and what we actually turn out to be. Before we go further into the forest, before we meet the wolf with eyes like captured sunlight and a history that makes the oldest trees look like saplings, let's take a moment to appreciate this channel, because stories like this one only happen when people like you show up and make them possible. If you're new here, welcome to a place where supernatural romance means something more than just 2 attractive people discovering they're fated, where the love stories we tell are the kind that remake the people inside them from the foundation up. Hit that subscribe button and stay, because we have so many more stories waiting for you, and this one is just getting started. The first winter nearly killed her. She said this to no one. Years later, in the conversational way she had developed of narrating her own life to the empty clearing, a habit she'd grown into as a defense against the particular madness of total silence, a way of insisting on the realness of her own experience by putting it into words, even when the only audience was the trees and occasional curious birds. The first winter nearly killed her, she would say, and she meant it in all the literal ways. The cold that got into her bones in October and didn't fully leave until April. the weeks when the hunting was poor, and she learned what real hunger felt like, distinguished from the normal hunger she'd known in the pack, which was always temporary and always answered. She meant the infection that came from a wound she'd gotten falling on her own knife in November, when her hands were too numb to be precise. That had climbed her arm in red lines toward her heart, until she'd found the right combination of herbs by a process of panicked experimentation that was more luck than knowledge. She meant the night a creature she couldn't name and didn't see clearly had circled her shelter for 6 hours while she sat with her back against the wall, and her knife in her hand, and her teeth clenched to keep them from chattering, not entirely from cold. But she had made it, and the second winter was harder in some ways, and easier in others, because hardship has a teaching function when you're willing to let it teach. And Mara had always been a person who paid attention. She had learned which roots could be dried and stored, which bark made a tea that kept fever manageable, where the deer moved when the first frosts came, how to read the forest's moods the way she had never been able to read the pack's political currents. The forest, she discovered, was honest in a way that communities of people rarely managed. It didn't pretend. When it wanted to kill you, it sent cold or teeth or infection without accompanying social courtesies. When it provided, the provision was real and didn't come with obligation attached. She found this refreshing in a way she couldn't have articulated to anyone who hadn't needed to find it refreshing. By the 3rd year, she had a shelter that was something approaching a real structure, built into the eastern face of a granite outcropping that gave her 3 natural walls and required her to construct only one. With a roof of overlapping bark tiles, she'd spent an entire summer perfecting until they shed rain almost completely. She had a garden of medicinal herbs in the clearing before it, laid out with the meticulous organization of someone who had never been allowed to apply her natural precision to anything the pack considered worthwhile. She had a system for smoking and preserving meat that she'd worked out through failure and iteration. She had a relationship with the forest. That was not friendship exactly, because the forest was not a person, and she tried to be rigorous about anthropomorphizing things, but was something like mutual recognition. Something like the understanding that develops between 2 entities that have spent enough time in close proximity to have learned each other's rhythms. What she didn't have was anyone to talk to, which was why she talked to herself, and to the plants while she tended them, and occasionally to the sky in a tone that might have looked like prayer from a distance, but was more accurately described as commentary. Mara's ongoing editorial on the experience of being alive in a world that had made clear it had not reserved a specific place for her. On the morning the wolf appeared, she was doing exactly that. She was kneeling at the edge of her herb garden in the gray light of early autumn, pulling the last of the season's feverfew and talking to it in a low murmur about the nature of fever, how the body's instinct to heat itself against infection was genuinely clever when you thought about it, how the plant's role was not to fight the fever, but to keep it from exceeding the range of usefulness, that there was a metaphor in there somewhere about the difference between support and suppression that she hadn't entirely worked out yet. She was mid-thought, hands deep in the herb-scented earth, when the sound reached her. It was not the sound of a predator approaching, because predators approaching don't generally make sounds, or make only the sounds that are unavoidable. The sounds of weight on ground and air through leaves. This was a different sound, a sound that had effort in it, labored and rhythmic, the sound of something that was moving when movement was costing it significantly. Mara was still before the sound fully registered, the particular stillness that comes not from fear, but from the hunter's attention, from years of learning to process information before reacting to it. She turned slowly, and the wolf was there at the tree line. He was enormous. She had seen wolves before, the shifters in Thornwood who ran in their animal forms along the boundaries, and she had seen wild wolves twice in 6 years of forest living, and none of them had prepared her for the scale of this animal, which stood at the edge of her clearing like a creature that had been built to a different set of specifications than the wolves she had known. Larger through the chest, taller at the shoulder, with a mass that suggested not just size but a fundamental density, as though he was made of something heavier than ordinary wolf. His coat was black, not the black of darkness, but the black of something that absorbed light and returned nothing, a black that seemed to have depth to it, layers, and his eyes, which were fixed on her with an attention that raised every hair on her arms and the back of her neck, were gold, not amber, not the yellow-brown of most wolf eyes, but a gold that was almost luminous, that caught the gray morning light, and did something with it that gold wasn't supposed to be able to do with gray morning light. He had an arrow in his flank. The arrow was not new. It had been there long enough that the area around it had begun to close over the shaft in the way that deep wounds sometimes do, sealing the damage inside rather than expelling it, which was its own kind of problem. He was moving with a hitch in his gait that spoke of pain, managed rather than pain absent, the walk of something that had decided not to stop moving, despite what stopping would feel like. He crossed 3 steps into her clearing, and then stopped, and stood, and looked at her with those impossible gold eyes that held something she had no framework for identifying, something she would later describe as the look of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing for so long that the wait has become the organizing principle of their entire existence, and has just seen it. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the arrow. Then she looked back at his eyes. "That needs to come out," she said, because she was a practical person, and the situation had a clear practical dimension. The wolf's ears moved in a way that was not quite a response, but was not nothing either. She got her kit. What she did next, she would tell people later, was simply what the situation required. She had pulled thorns and splinters, and once an entire broken branch from wounded animals before, had coaxed sick foxes through fever and set the legs of injured deer with the limited resources available to her, because the forest brought her its injured, and she had developed a reputation among its creatures. If creatures could be said to have reputations, and to share information about them, which she privately believed they could, an injured wolf was a different scale of problem, but not a different kind of problem. The fact that this wolf was looking at her with eyes that seemed to understand her completely was a fact she filed carefully in the part of her mind reserved for things to be examined in detail later, when the immediate practical matter had been addressed. She worked slowly, telling him what she was doing before she did it, explaining each step. Not because she thought he understood words, but because her experience with injured animals was that the voice had a calming function, independent of semantic content, that the ongoing human sound of someone talking told the animal body that the person nearby was not in a panic state, and therefore need not be in a panic state, that the steadiness of a calm voice could be borrowed when one's own steadiness was harder to locate. She cleaned around the shaft with an infusion of yarrow and calendula that she'd prepared that morning by coincidence or providence, or the universe's occasional habit of arranging for the right resources to be in the right place at the right time. She checked the angle of the arrow and determined that it had not gone deep enough to threaten any organ she could identify, which was the good news. She explained to him that this was going to hurt, which was the honest news. He didn't move when she removed the arrow. He made no sound. The wound bled freely for a moment, and then she packed it with a poultice of plantain and comfrey and yarrow, and held it in place with strips of cloth torn from a shirt she'd been meaning to use for rags anyway, wrapping the bandage under his foreleg and over his back in a configuration that required her to lean very close to him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, which was substantial, a warmth that was more than animal warmth, that had something of the quality of being near a banked fire, and she was aware with a precision she couldn't explain of the exact moment when his breathing changed, when it went from the controlled, careful rhythm of pain management to something slower and deeper, something that sounded improbably like relief. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels and looking at her work. "You're going to need to rest it. If you let me check it tomorrow, I can change the dressing and make sure it's not festering. That's the real risk with wounds that have been closed over like that, the infection that builds up inside." She paused. "I'm talking to a wolf," she added, in a tone that acknowledged the absurdity, while also declining to be particularly troubled by it. The wolf looked at her. That look again. The one with centuries in it. The one that made her feel as though she was being seen with a thoroughness and attention that no person had ever applied to her. A look that said, I know you in a way that should have been impossible given that they had met approximately 40 minutes ago. He didn't leave. She went back to her feverfew. He was there when she woke up the next morning, lying at the edge of the clearing with his head on his forepaws and his gold eyes open, watching the door of her shelter with an attention that suggested he had been doing this for some time, possibly all night. She stood in her doorway with her morning tea and looked at him, and he looked at her. And the silence between them was not the silence of two strangers who have nothing to say to each other, but the silence of two people who have reached a temporary agreement to simply be in the same space, without demanding that it mean anything yet. You stayed, she said. His ears moved. I'm going to call you Cale, she said, because she needed something to call him, and the name had arrived in her mind fully formed without obvious explanation, sitting there with the comfortable certainty of a thing that has always been true. The way sometimes you look at a person and know their name before they tell you. Not because you're psychic, but because something in the architecture of them matches the architecture of a specific arrangement of sounds. Unless you have objections. The wolf that was Kyle closed, his eyes briefly, and then opened them again, and she took this for the absence of objection. This is the part of the story, the part right here, where I need you to do something for me. I need you to like this video. Not for the algorithm, though also for the algorithm, but because Mara has just named something that has been nameless and lost for 200 years, and that deserves to be marked. She didn't know that. She just needed something to call him, but some things matter whether or not. We know why they matter. And the name Cale falling from her lips in the gray autumn morning, landing on the wolf who had waited 2 centuries without knowing what he was waiting for, is one of those things. Like the video. And then come back, because we are just barely inside the door of this story, and there is so much more of it. Over the weeks that followed, Mara developed a routine that accommodated Kyle's presence with the pragmatic adaptability that 6 years of solo forest survival had, made her natural mode of operation. He did not go into her shelter, which she hadn't offered and he hadn't attempted, maintaining a respectful separation that she found she appreciated without quite knowing why. A recognition of the difference between near and intrusive that she hadn't known she'd needed from him until he gave it. He slept at the edge of the clearing. During the day, he moved with her when she moved. Not at her heel like a dog, but parallel to her, slightly off to one side, at a distance that maintained itself with an eerie consistency regardless of terrain, as though he had calculated the precise proximity that communicated companionship without crowding and then locked it in as a fixed parameter. The wound healed faster than she expected, faster than any wound she had treated before, which she added to her growing file of facts about Cale that she was collecting carefully for future examination. She changed the dressing for 5 days, and on the 6th, the skin was closed completely, not scarred over, but healed, genuinely healed in the way that took most animals weeks and most humans longer, smooth and whole as though the arrow had been a dream. She ran her fingers along the healed skin and felt his muscles ripple in response to the touch. Not a flinch, but something closer to a shiver, the involuntary response of a body that was experiencing something it wasn't used to. "You're not normal," she told him, during the dressing change on day 4, sitting back, with her hands still warm from contact with his side, speaking in the casual tone she used for her observations, the tone that was factual rather than accusatory. "I don't mean that as a complaint. Normal is a flexible concept, and I'm not sure it applies out here anyway, but you're healing about 3 times as fast as you should be. And you've been following me with a level of comprehension that actual wolves don't demonstrate. And last night when I was working out that problem with the shelter, roof brace, you moved to exactly the angle where you were blocking the wind for me without me asking, which either means you have sophisticated environmental modeling or you were responding to something I communicated without knowing I was communicating it." She considered him. "I think you understand what I'm saying right now." Kyle looked at her steadily and said nothing, because he was a wolf and wolves don't speak, but the steadiness of the look said everything. And Mara was a woman who had spent 6 years learning to read communication that didn't come in the form of words. "Okay," she said. "I'm not going to push it. But I want you to know that I'm paying attention. I've been paying attention my whole life, and people keep being surprised by it, which tells me more about them than it does about me." She could have sworn, and would never swear to this out loud, that something in his expression shifted at that. Some quality of the gold in his eyes that was not quantity of light, but quality of it, that moved in a way that she had no word for, a movement that she felt in her chest before she registered it in her eyes, a small, intimate shift that felt like the first, careful step taken by someone who has learned through long, painful experience to move very slowly across uncertain ground. The first snow came early that year, which the forest had been warning her about in its patient, indirect way for weeks. The behaviors of squirrels, and the timing of the geese, and the particular quality of certain dawns that had a winter smell to them before winter had any right to be smelling like itself. She had her stores in order, her shelter insulated and sealed, her wood stacked. What she hadn't fully thought through was Kale, specifically the question of Kale in deep winter. Whether a wolf who healed at supernatural speeds and observed her with a philosopher's attention and blocked the wind for her without being asked had needs that her current arrangements were capable of serving, whether she was responsible for those needs, and what it meant about her that she had already decided. The answer to the third question was yes, before she'd fully worked through the first two. She cut the second question by watching him move through the first genuine cold snap of November, observing that he didn't shiver and didn't seek additional shelter, and moved through the freezing temperatures with the unhurried ease of something that was generating more internal heat than the cold could usefully challenge, which resolved the practical concern and left her with only the third question, which wasn't really a question at all, so much as an acknowledgement about herself that she was in the process of making. She was in the process of caring what happened to him. This was, if she was being rigorous about it, the first time in 6 years that she had cared what happened to a specific other entity, had allowed the continuation of another life to become something that mattered to her own comfort and functioning, had let someone else's welfare become structurally important to her own. She examined this fact with the same careful attention she gave to everything, turning it over, looking at its underside, checking for places where it might be fragile or false. She didn't find any. It seemed to be solid all the way through, which was terrifying in one register and something else entirely in another. Kale, for his part, seemed to be having his own process about her, though his process expressed itself in the limited vocabulary available to him in his current form. There was the wind blocking. There was the specific alertness he demonstrated when she was moving through the forest, and something else was also moving through the forest. A shift in his posture and attention that preceded any sound she could detect and had, twice, turned her away from paths before she could determine what he had noticed on them. There was the night she had badly misjudged. The severity of an infected cut on her palm, and had woken at 3 a.m. with the red lines starting, with fever beginning to climb, and had found him already at her door, already making the particular low sound he had for urgency, already positioned between her and the dark of the forest, with an intention in his body that was not wolf-like in any way she could attribute to instinct, that was deliberate and chosen and directed entirely at her. She had treated the infection. It had been close, genuinely close, and she'd been shaking badly by the time the yarrow tea started to pull the fever down, and he had come to the door of her shelter then, and put his head over the threshold, which was as close to inside as he had ever come, and looked at her with those gold eyes that had all those centuries in them. And she had looked back from her blankets with her palm wrapped, and her fever breaking, and something cracking open in her chest that she couldn't have described to anyone, and wasn't going to try. "I'm all right," she said. He stayed at the threshold until she fell asleep. Here is something about Kale that she didn't know yet. Something the story requires you to hold while she slowly discovers it in pieces over the months that follow. 212 years ago, Kale Ashvale, for Ashvale was his name, and the forest its inheritance, was Alpha King of a territory that encompassed all the lands now divided between 7 separate packs including Thornwood, was the most powerful wolf shifter of his generation, and possibly of several generations, was known for a governance that some of his council called reckless, and his people called just, that prioritized the welfare of individuals over the maintenance of hierarchical structure and refused to treat the weak as disposable weight. He had enemies in proportion to his power, as powerful things always do, and his enemies were patient in the way that people who have resources and position are patient. In the way that people who need to wait for exactly the right moment are patient, in the way that makes patience itself a weapon. The Council of 7 Elders, who had, over the years of his reign, accumulated enough of their own quiet influence to believe themselves capable of replacing his judgment with theirs, had 2 problems with Kale. The first was that he was right about nearly everything, which made arguing with him publicly a losing proposition and made the population generally inclined toward his positions. The second was that he kept refusing to use the power of the king's position for their benefit, kept redirecting resources toward border communities and healers and the kinds of infrastructure that helped ordinary people, rather than toward the consolidated strength of the council's own holdings. They had approached him privately with their preferred arrangements. He had declined privately. They had escalated. He had declined with diminishing patience. They had made the calculation that a king who could not be bought and would not be intimidated and was too right too often to be discredited had only one remaining vulnerability, which was that he was embodied, that he existed in flesh and form, and could therefore be acted upon by things that acted on flesh and form. The eldest of them, a woman named Senna, who had spent 40 years accumulating knowledge of the old magics while presenting herself publicly as a scholar, rather than a practitioner, led the working. It required 7 of them, which was why the council was 7, which was not coincidence. It required the blood of the one to be sealed, which they had obtained by methods she had never fully disclosed to the others. It required the willing participation of a bloodline that held the key, because the old magics insisted on that, insisted on the consent of someone who had the power to reverse the working, which was Senna's one concession to the rules she was breaking, her one structural gesture toward balance, though she managed the consent by ensuring that the person whose blood she used didn't understand what they were consenting to, which she told herself was consent, and which was not. The seal took Kyle on a moonless night in autumn, took him between one form and the other, left him locked in the wolf with no way to return, and began the slow fragmentation of his consciousness across the weight of years, which was the seal's most deliberate cruelty, its designer's understanding that a mind locked in one form without the relief of the other would eventually begin to lose its architecture, that the human part of him would fade and scatter until there was nothing left but the wolf, pure animal, all the centuries of intelligence and memory dissolved. Senna had calculated that this process would take approximately 50 years, which was her way of ensuring that no one who remembered what Kale had been would still be alive when the thing wearing his body finally lost the last of him. She had not calculated for the strength of him. She had not calculated for the way that a mind like Kale's, a mind that had spent a lifetime governing and reading and understanding and choosing with an unusual clarity, would resist the dissolution not by fighting it, but by going slow, by conserving the most essential parts of himself in the deep interior while letting the surface scatter, by maintaining the core of his identity in a kind of hibernation that was not consciousness exactly, but was not its absence either. He had been fragmenting for 2 centuries, but he had been fragmenting slowly, and the core of him was still there, still intact, still Kyle, waiting with the patience of someone who has nothing to do but wait, and has decided to make the waiting itself an act of will. He had not known what he was waiting for, precisely. He had known, in the way that old magic tends to encode itself in the bones of the people it touches, that there was a key, that the key was blood, that the blood was a lineage that had the same roots as the working, that Senna's use of her own bloodline's consent, in the construction of the seal, had built into it the mechanism of its own undoing, that somewhere in the centuries between his sealing and now, that bloodline would produce someone capable of reversing it. He had known this the way you sometimes know things in dreams, without the knowing being attached to specific information, without being able to say exactly how you know or exactly what it is you know. just the bedrock certainty of it underneath everything else. And then Mara had pressed her hands, cut from the feverfew harvesting that morning, against his wounded flank, and her blood had touched the seal, and the seal had recognized the lineage, and Cale had felt, for the first time in 212 years, something that was not the slow dissolution of himself into animal. He had felt himself, the human part of him, the Cale part of him, begin to coalesce, begin to come back, begin the long, slow process of return. This is why he had come to her clearing, not by conscious navigation, because his conscious navigation was still largely wolf, still operating on instinct and sense, and the body's knowledge of the land. He had come to her the way migrating birds go south, the way salmon go to their birth rivers, the way all created things go toward the conditions of their undoing and their restoration, which are often the same thing. He had come to her because the part of him that was still Cale had known, somewhere beneath the fragmentation and the centuries, that she was there. If you want to understand this story, keep that in your chest. Hold it the way Cale had held the last of himself through 2 centuries of dissolution, because everything that comes next is about what happens when someone who has spent a long time losing themselves begins, slowly and imperfectly and at great cost, to come back. The first time she saw him in human form, she thought she was dreaming. This was not unreasonable. It was the night of the winter solstice, which she had been aware of with her usual precise attention to the cycles of the year, and she had gone to sleep with Cale at the clearing's edge as always, and woken at some hour past midnight to a light that was not moonlight and not firelight, and was not any light she had a framework for, a light that came from the clearing itself, from the air above the spot where Cale usually lay, a light that was more a property of attention than of illumination, the light that exists in the moment, before something you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting for it finally arrives. She stood in her doorway, and she watched. What she saw was not a transformation in any dramatic sense, was not the violent reshaping that werewolf stories always described, the snapping of bones and the tearing of form. It was more like a clarification, like watching fog lift from a landscape that was already there, like the light in a room when the clouds finally move, and what has always been present simply becomes visible. The wolf that was Cale simply became something else, something larger in some dimensions and smaller in others, something that stood upright and had the outline of a man, and then was a man, standing in her clearing in the moonless solstice night with the strange light settling around him and going out. He was very tall. He was dark-haired and dark-complexioned and built with the same sense of fundamental density as his wolf form, that quality of being made of something heavier than ordinary materials, that mass that was not bulk, but substance. His eyes were still gold. They were still his. He stood very still for a long moment, as though testing the reality of standing, as though the body needed to verify itself against the experience of having been a different body for a very long time. Then he looked at her, and the look was the same look. The centuries-deep look, the look that knew her. And she understood in a single breathless moment that this was not new, that this was not a stranger, that she had been looking into those eyes across a clearing every morning for months, and had known them already. "Mara," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, rough from 200 years of silence, rough in the way of things that have not been used for so long that use itself requires relearning. And he said her name as though he had been holding it somewhere for safekeeping, as though it was the first word he wanted to spend when speech came back to him. And she stood in her doorway with her hands against the doorframe, and felt the name hit her chest, like something physical, felt it land in the part of her that had been telling herself for months that the way she felt about a wolf was simply the result of prolonged solitude, and was not anything to examine too closely. "You know my name," she said. "I know more than your name." His voice was finding itself as he spoke, smoothing out at the edges, finding its register. But underneath the roughness, it was a voice with depth and precision, the voice of someone who thought carefully about everything and spoke carefully about most things. "I have been trying to find the words for what I know for a long time, longer than you would believe if I told you directly." "Try?" she said. He looked at her steadily in the way she had learned to read across months of a face that expressed everything in the eyes, because the rest of it was Wolf. He was figuring out how much to give her. She recognized this calculation because she did it herself constantly. The internal assessment of how much truth a situation could hold, how much could be offered without overwhelming the container. "I should tell you that I will be gone before morning," he said instead, which was not an evasion, but a prioritization. "This form isn't stable yet. I have enough of myself back to hold it for, again, a few hours, but not more. I wanted you to know what I was. I wanted you to be able to choose what happened next with full information." "What are you?" she asked. He told her some of it: the Alpha King, the Council, the Seal, the 2 centuries in the Wolf. He did not tell her all of it, not yet, because some parts of it required more trust than a single impossible night could build, and because the part that involved her was the part he was most careful with, the part he understood most clearly, needed to be approached with the greatest care, because it was the part that could make her feel like a key, rather than a person if he handled it badly. He told her what had happened to him. He did not yet tell her why she was involved in it. She listened without interrupting, standing in her doorway with her arms crossed, not in defense but in the posture of careful attention. And when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "How much do you remember?" she asked. "Of being human?" "More than I did a month ago," he said. "Less than I will remember in another month." A pause. "The process is going in the right direction now. Your blood began something. Each time you touch me, it continues. Each time you speak to me, it continues. You are not the mechanism of this. I want to be clear that you are a person and not a mechanism. But you are the reason." She stood with this. "That's a significant amount to put on someone," she said. "Yes. I know. I'm sorry for it." Another silence. "You going to disappear now?" she asked. "Not yet." "Then come inside," she said. "You've been sleeping in the clearing for months. At minimum, you should see what the inside looks like." He blinked, and there was something in the blinking, some quality of surprise in it, that made her think he had been preparing for a very different response to his disclosure, and had not fully prepared for this one, for simple practical hospitality, for the door being opened. She thought perhaps no one had simply opened the door for him in a very long time. She thought perhaps that was something she could understand. "I need to pause here. I need you to feel what just happened. This woman who has been alone for 6 years, who was told she was broken, who has been building her entire life from scratch on the other side of a wall of rejection, just opened her door for the person who has been sleeping at the edge of her clearing for months, now revealed as a sealed king with 2 centuries of silence inside. Him. And she opened the door, not because she trusted everything he'd said or understood everything she was feeling, but because the door had always been the right thing to open. Comment below. Tell me what you felt when she said come inside. I need to know. He was gone by morning, as he'd said, the form dissolving back into the wolf as the solstice night gave way to the hour before dawn. And she woke to find Kale the wolf at the edge of the clearing, with his gold eyes already on her door, as always, and the memory of the night sitting in her chest like a stone that had been placed there carefully by someone who understood exactly where it belonged. She stood in her doorway with her morning tea and looked at him, and he looked at her, and the silence was different now, was full in the way that silences become full when they contain things that have been said, things that can't be unsaid and can't be unknown. "Good morning," she said. His ears moved. Over the following weeks, she continued her routines, and he continued his, and the thing between them continued its slow clarification, the way things do when both parties have decided to let them continue without forcing the pace, when both parties have enough experience with things breaking to want to let this one find its own rate of solidification. She talked to him more than she had before, or perhaps she talked to him the same amount but differently, with the full understanding that he was receiving everything she said, and was processing it with the whole of a century's deep intelligence, which changed her relationship to her own voice, which gave her words back to her with a weight she hadn't felt since she was young and believed that people were listening. She told him about the expulsion, not the facts of it, which were simple, but the texture of it, the specific quality of the 16-year-old girl standing at the boundary stones with 4 days of dried meat and a hunting knife, the way the turned backs had felt, the way Petra's hesitation had been somehow worse than the other's certainty, because it had contained a kindness that had chosen not to act. She told him about the first winter and the infection, and the 6 hours of the circling creature, and the way the 3rd year had felt different, like something had shifted, like she had finally persuaded herself that she was going to survive, and could therefore invest in things that required a future. She told him about talking to the plants, and to the sky, and he listened with his gold eyes and his tilted head, and the focused attention of someone who was receiving a gift, and knew it, and handled it accordingly. In February, at the dark of the moon, he came back in human form. This time he lasted longer, nearly an entire night, and was more himself, more present, with more of the roughness gone from his voice, and more of his memory available, and more of the quality she was coming to recognize as specifically Kale, the considered careful quality, the habit of sitting with a thing before speaking about it, the way he sometimes looked at the fire she'd built with an expression she couldn't fully read, the expression of someone who is encountering something ordinary and finding it extraordinary because they have been away from the ordinary for so long. He told her more about the territory as it had been, the 7 communities and the governance that had tried to hold them in a balance that didn't require anyone to be disposable, about the council and Senna and the patient accumulation of their opposition, about the night of the ceiling and what it had felt like, not the pain of it, but the terrible specific quality of feeling himself begin to separate, the human part of him lifting away from the wolf part, and then the seal closing over both of them and beginning its long, slow work. "Were you conscious?" she asked. "All this time?" "In parts." He considered how to explain this. There were long periods that were simply wolf, simply the body in the forest with no Kale in it, no person. And there were shorter periods, particularly around the solstices and equinoxes, when something of me would surface and be aware enough to understand what was happening. Those periods were the difficult ones. The wolf periods were not suffering because there was no one to suffer. The aware periods were something else. She was quiet, looking at the fire. 212 years, she said. "Yes, of that. Yes." She looked at him then. Looked at him the way she had been not quite looking at him all evening, the full direct look, and he returned it with the full direct attention that was simply his fundamental mode, the mode of someone who had stopped bothering to look away from things a very long time ago. "Tell me about the bloodline," she said. "Tell me what I am to this." He told her that Senna, in the construction of the seal, had used the blood of her own granddaughter, a young woman named Lyra, who had been told she was participating in a protective working for the territory, who had given her blood, believing she was protecting her community, and had in fact been made the key to an imprisonment. That the magic, because the old magics insisted on this kind of balance, even when the people working them tried to circumvent it, had encoded into the seal the terms of its undoing, which required the willing, informed, understanding action of a direct descendant of Lyra's line. That Mara was the last of that line, the line having thinned over generations until it produced her. A woman with no apparent wolf form and no apparent power who had been expelled from the only pack that had known her family's history, exiled into the forest that had been Kale's original territory, in proximity to the seal. "Senna engineered the expulsion," Mara said. "It was not a question. I believe so, or her descendants did. The council that exists now is not the original 7, but the purpose has persisted. They sent me into the forest to be near you," she said. "They used me as a tool. They attempted to," he said carefully. "What you do with this information is yours to decide. What has happened between you and me is ours to decide. The council's manipulation of the circumstances does not determine the reality of what you've chosen within them. You didn't know the context. Your choices were made freely. They were made because of who you are." She sat with this for a long time. He let her sit with it, which was one of the things about him that she was learning, the gift of the pause, the refusal to fill silences with things that were meant to manage her response, rather than allow it. "If I undo the seal," she said finally, "if you're fully restored, what happens?" "I don't know," he said. "I haven't been fully present in this world for 2 centuries. The territory has changed. The packs have changed. I don't know what restoration means in a context this different from the one I left. Are you afraid of finding out?" A long pause, during which the fire did what fires do, speaking its own language of light and heat, while the 2 people near it spoke theirs. "I am more afraid," he said slowly, "of you discovering that I've been using your proximity for my own restoration and concluding that this is all I am to you, that I am a circumstance you've been placed in, rather than a person you've chosen." She looked at him steadily. She thought about 6 years alone, and about the turned backs at the boundary stones, and about the long, careful months of him at the edge of her clearing, blocking the wind, watching the door, staying when he could have gone. She thought about what it meant to see someone, really see them, to receive their presence as a gift and not as a resource. "Cale," she said. He looked at her. "You slept outside my door for 6 months," she said, "in the cold. When I got sick, you stayed at the threshold all night. You moved to block the wind, for me without being asked. You've told me things tonight that you've been carrying for 200 years, and you told them to me carefully, in the order that would be clearest and truest for me to receive them, not in the order that would be most useful for whatever it is you need from me. I know what people look like when they're using someone. I grew up in a place where I was assessed for use on a regular basis." She held his gaze. "You don't look like that." He was very still. "You look," she said more quietly, "like someone who has been waiting a very long time and has learned to wait without demanding, and is now in the presence of something that he is terrified of wanting too directly, in case the wanting itself damages it." The gold in his eyes did the thing it did sometimes, the thing she had no word for, the movement of quality rather than quantity of light. "You are very precise," he said. "I've had a lot of time to pay attention," she said. "Before we go further, I need you to subscribe to this channel. I'm asking sincerely, not as a routine request, but because we are right here, in this moment, in this conversation between 2 people who have both been told in different ways that they were insufficient, and you staying here with them is part of what makes this story real. Subscribe. And then come back, because this is where the outside world is about to arrive." The council sent the first hunters in March, which told Mara something important about their surveillance capabilities, because the signs of Cale's partial restoration were subtle, and she had not been announcing them, which meant either they had sources in the forest she hadn't detected, or they had sources closer to her history than that, which led her down a particular line of reasoning about Thornwood Pack and Elder Voss, and the expression that might have been pity, and the 4 days of dried meat pressed into her hands, which had always felt like too convenient a provision for a spontaneous expulsion. She had been half a day's walk from her clearing when she encountered the first hunter, a man in Thornwood tracking colors moving through the forest with a purpose that was not hunting any animal, moving toward her location with the directional certainty of someone following either a scent or a map. She had turned back immediately, moving through the forest in the pattern she'd developed over years for covering ground quickly, without announcing her passage, and had arrived at the clearing to find Cale already alert, already standing at the center of the clearing with his head high and his attention directed at the forest's eastern edge, from which she had not come. "There are 2 more," she said, reading his posture, coming from the east. He turned to look at her, and she read the conflict in his eyes, the specific quality of a person who is confronting a situation in which their capacity to respond is limited by their form, who is a wolf when what the situation requires is a king. "How long until the next time you can hold the human form?" she asked. He showed her. 2 weeks, approximately, the next dark of the moon. "Then we work with what we have," she said. "I've been living in this forest for 6 years, and they've been in theirs. That is a significant tactical advantage." She looked at him steadily. "Trust me?" He looked back at her with his whole gold-eyed attention and said nothing, because he didn't need to. What followed was 3 days of Mara, being precisely herself in circumstances that required everything she had learned in 6 years of solitary forest survival. She moved the hunters in circles using the forest's own geometry against them, using her knowledge of the terrain's acoustics to send sounds to the wrong locations, using her understanding of the wind patterns to approach and withdraw, without her scent preceding her. She avoided direct confrontation, not from fear, but from the cold calculation that her best outcome was for them to find nothing and return nothing, and report that the forest had been investigated and contained no significant information, which was better than an outcome where they found something and understood what they'd found. Kyle was with her the whole time, the parallel presence maintained at its consistent distance, and there were moments during those 3 days when she was navigating a particularly delicate piece of the terrain and felt his attention shift, felt something in the space between them change quality, and she understood that she was drawing on something. Not magic exactly in the way she understood magic, but something, some quality of the connection between them that was giving her information she wouldn't have had on her own. A sense of where the hunters were and how they were moving. That was more precise than her own senses could have provided. She didn't mention this to him. She filed it in the careful part of her mind, where she kept the things she would examine. When the immediate situation allowed for examination, she used it, because she was pragmatic, and the situation required pragmatism, and she thought perhaps he was extending it to her deliberately, thought perhaps this was another version of blocking the wind. The hunters left on the 4th day. She waited 2 more days to be certain, walking the forest's perimeter in a wide arc that confirmed their absence, and when she returned to the clearing, she sat down by her fire, with Kale beside her, and felt something she didn't experience often, which was the specific sensation of having managed something difficult, and the knowledge that she hadn't managed it alone. "They'll come back," she said. He made the sound she'd come to read as yes. "With more, probably. The same sound. We need to be able to address them as something other than a woman and a wolf," she said. "We need you back." She looked at the fire. "The undoing. What does it require from me? What do I need to do?" He was quiet for a long moment, which she read as a particular kind of quiet, not the absence of words, but the weighing of them. She waited. "It requires intention," he said, in the rough voice of the solstice form, which she understood meant she was getting a few hours, meant the moon was doing something cooperative. She turned to find him sitting beside her. The wolf form dissolved, the man present, closer to the fire than he'd sat before, and looking at her with an expression that was doing several things at once. "The seal's construction required the understanding participation of your bloodline's power. The undoing requires the same. You would need to know what you're doing and mean it." "Then tell me what I'm doing," she said. "It is not only technical," he said carefully. "Senna built it with the old magic's insistence on truth. The working that undoes the seal is not a spell or a formula. It is an act. Specifically, it is the act of a person of your bloodline who understands the situation fully, who offers their recognition freely, and who chooses. That is the old magic's version of consent. It cannot be performed as a procedure. It requires that it be true." She looked at him. "What kind of recognition?" she asked quietly. The gold in his eyes. "The kind," he said with the care of someone laying down something very fragile and very heavy, "that I believe you already have, that I have watched growing in you for months, that I have watched you being honest with yourself about, that you have named in other words in conversations by a fire when you didn't know I was receiving every word as something I had not been given in 2 centuries. A pause. "I am not asking you to feel something you don't feel. I am telling you that the magic requires truth, and that I believe the truth exists, and that it is yours, and that you are the one who decides what to do with it." The fire, the clearing, the 2 of them in the middle of the winter forest that was also, in some way she was, still working out his. "You've been very careful," she said, "not to tell me what I feel. "That is not mine to tell," he said. "No," she agreed. She looked at him for a long time, doing the things she did, paying attention, applying the full precision of her attention to the thing in front of her. She looked at the man who had slept outside her door for months, who had blocked the wind and watched the threshold and been careful. So careful, with every piece of truth he gave her, who had 200 years of silence inside him and had chosen to spend the first of his returned words on her name, who was sitting by her fire right now with his gold eyes and his centuries and his extraordinary care for whether she was choosing freely, whether she was choosing truly, whether what existed between them was real and not circumstance, who had told her she was not a mechanism and meant it, and built his entire behavior since to demonstrate it. She thought about what it felt like to be seen. She thought about the 6 years, and the boundary stones, and the turned backs, and the harvesting of plants alone in a clearing talking to the sky. She thought about the morning she'd woken up, and he'd been there, looking at her door, steady and waiting, and how she'd stood in the doorway with her morning tea, and something in her chest had moved in a way she'd been telling herself was not what it obviously was. "Kale," she said. He was entirely still. She reached out and put her hand against his face, the way she would have put her hand against the side of the wolf, the gesture she'd been making for months without its full meaning, and felt his sharp intake of breath and said, "I see you. I have been seeing you. I choose this." The old magic did not announce itself. It did not make dramatic claims. It did not flash or thunder or perform any of the gestures that stories usually use to mark the moments when something that has been sealed for 2 centuries finally releases its hold. What happened was quieter than that, was more like a lock that had been waiting for the exact correct key and, finding it, simply opened, the mechanism turning with the ease of something that had always been designed for this specific moment. A warmth moved through the clearing. Not heat, but warmth. The kind that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the feeling of recognition, of something being returned to itself, of an ending that is also, immediately and without pause, a beginning. Kyle's breath came out slow and long, the breath of someone who has been holding it for 212 years, and is only now remembering how to exhale. His eyes closed and opened, and when they opened, they were the same gold but more present, more solid, more entirely there, as though the quality of gold that had always seemed to be looking from a great distance had finally, for the first time in centuries, arrived. "Mara," he said. His voice was different. Still his voice. Still the voice she'd come to know, but fully itself now, without the roughness of disuse, without the strain of partial restoration, a voice that carried its full weight. "Still here," she said. "This is the moment. This is what the whole story has been moving toward. Leave me a comment that's just the word here if you felt it. Here. Tell me you were with them in that clearing." But the story doesn't end with the undoing of the seal. It never ends at the moment of the declaration, because declarations are openings, not conclusions. And what followed for Mara and Kyle was the long, real work of everything after the first extraordinary thing. He was fully himself in the weeks that followed, shifting freely between forms, the disorientation of restoration, giving way gradually to the steadiness of someone who had always known who he was, and was simply reclaiming the full use of that knowledge. He was, she found, exactly what the months of watching had suggested. Considered, and precise, and patient, and deeply serious about the things he was serious about, with a dry humor that emerged in unexpected places, and a habit of noticing things that most people missed, and saying them out loud without apology, which she found deeply, specifically comfortable in the way that you find comfortable only the things that match you exactly. He did not immediately attempt to reclaim territory, or re-establish authority, or do any of the things that the narrative of a returned king might imply. He walked the forest with her in his wolf form and in his human form, and learned its current configuration. 6 years of Mara's careful knowledge mapped against 2 centuries of his own deep familiarity with the land, and they spent the long winter evenings building something between them that was knowledge at first, then trust, than the kind of intimacy that develops between people who have both decided to be rigorously honest about what they are and what they want and what they're afraid of, which is rarer than it sounds and more precious than almost anything. He told her things about the territory's original governance, about the principles he had tried to build the pack structures around, about where he thought those structures had failed and where he thought they had been on the right track. She told him about Thornwood in its current form, what she had known of it from the inside, and what she had observed from the outside in 6 years of proximity, and watched him receive this information with the particular quality of attention of someone who is updating a map, adding the current geography to the historical one, building the picture of what is from what was. "What are you going to do?" she asked him in January, 3 weeks after the seal's dissolution, lying on her back in the snow at the edge of the clearing and looking at the stars while he lay beside her in his wolf form, which he still seemed to prefer for the ordinary hours, as though the wolf were the comfortable mode and the human form were the one he dressed into for significant occasions. About the packs, about the territory. He shifted to human form to answer, which she'd noted he did when the answer required the full precision of language, when the wolf's vocabulary wasn't sufficient for what needed to be said. "I don't think I can walk back into Thornwood and declare a historical claim," he said. "That is not how change works, and it's not what needs to change. The structures that allowed the council to operate as they did in my time still exist, and what I know from your account is that they have been maintained through generations. That is not a problem you solve by replacing one authority with another. It's a problem you solve by changing the structures themselves. That's a long project," she said. "Yes. It doesn't bother you, compared to what you had?" He was quiet for a moment. "What I had was taken from me by people who understood that concentrating authority is easier than distributing it. I'm not interested in repeating the conditions of my own unsealing." A pause. "I'm also not the only person with relevant experience in building a life outside of what the pack structures prescribed." She turned her head to look at him. He looked back. "I would like," he said carefully, "to do this with you, not to direct it, not to use your knowledge as a resource, to do it with you, as people who have both had significant amounts of time to think about what communities should be and what they too often are, as people who have reasons to care about the people who end up on the wrong side of those structures." He paused. "If that is something you want." She thought about it. She thought about it with the genuine consideration it deserved, not as a foregone conclusion, but as a real question, because she was not a person who made significant decisions without examining them from all sides, and this was a significant decision. She thought about 6 years of building something from nothing, and how she had done it well, and how well she had done it alone, and how that well-doing alone had always had a specific texture to it, the texture of accomplishment that has no one to tell, of knowledge that doesn't get to be shared, of a fire that's well-built and warm, and has no second set of hands around it. She thought about the gold of his eyes, and the care of his telling, and the winter months of him at the edge of her clearing, blocking the wind. "Yes," she said, "I want that." Now subscribe to this channel because what comes next is Mara and Kale walking back into Thornwood, not as supplicants and not as conquerors, and the faces people make when they see who she has become, and the conversation she has with Petra, who hesitated at the boundary stones, and the moment Elder Voss understands what he spent 6 years helping to exile, and the beginning of the long, slow structural work that reforms not one pack but all of them, and I will not let you miss a single moment of it. The approach to Thornwood took 3 days, not because the physical distance required it, but because the approach had its own requirements, its own preparation, the kind that isn't logistical, but is something else. The settling of a person into the full truth of what they are before walking into the place that told them they were less than that. Mara walked most of those 3 days in silence, and Kale walked beside her in his wolf form, the parallel presence, at its consistent distance. And they spoke when they spoke, and were quiet when they were quiet, and the forest opened before them and closed behind them, and the boundary stones, when they arrived at them, were exactly as she had left them, gray and mossy, and neither welcoming nor forbidding, Stones doing what stones do, which is to simply be present and let the humans assign them meaning. She stopped at them and looked at them for a long moment. "The last time I crossed these," she said. "No," Cale said, from her left, having shifted while she was looking at the stones, standing in his human form with his hands in his pockets, in the posture she'd come to read as careful presence, as being there but not directing. "You don't have to go in if you've changed your mind." "I haven't changed my mind," she said. "I'm just giving this moment the weight it deserves." She stepped across the boundary stones. The territory of Thornwood was familiar and strange simultaneously. The specific quality of a place you have known well and then been away from, where everything is where you remember, and nothing is quite the same. The forest here was the same forest, the same trees, the same stone formations and stream patterns and bird populations, but there was something in it that she had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully been able to perceive from inside it, a quality of the air that was the presence of a community, the overlay of shared territory on landscape, the invisible but real architecture of a place that is inhabited and claimed and tended. They encountered the first patrol at midday. 2 young wolves, probably 3rd or 4th generation Thornwood, who did not know her face, and therefore had no immediate reaction to her presence, other than the territorial alertness that patrol duty was designed to produce. They had a significantly stronger reaction to Cale, who was emitting something in his fully restored form that was not visible and was not quite scent, but was something that pack wolves registered at a level prior to conscious processing, something that said, not threat, but also not pack, something that said other and old and significant in ways that didn't have names in the current pack vocabulary. "I'm Mara," she said, to the patrol's clear preparatory tension. "I was born to Thornwood. I was expelled 6 years ago. I've come back to speak with the Alpha." The patrol looked at each other and looked at her and looked at Kyle, and arrived at the only decision available to people who have encountered something they don't have the contextual framework to process, which was to bring it to someone who might have the framework. They were escorted to the pack house, which was larger than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply forgotten how large it was, the proportional memory of a child being unreliable about scale, and she walked through it with the specific sensation of the recovered exile, the adult returning to the child's geography, the complex emotion of belonging that was revoked and never fully unroked, that lived in the nervous system as a kind of permanent ambient grief, even when the conscious mind had made peace with it. Alpha Harkin was dead. She had not known this. His son, Aldrich, had the Alpha position now, a man perhaps 10 years older than Mara, who had been a young adult at her expulsion, and who looked at her now with the expression of a person who remembers something clearly and is in the process of assessing what that memory's moral weight currently is. "Mara Vance," he said. "Aldrich Harkin," she said. He looked at Cale, the same involuntary registering that the patrol had shown, but deeper, more informed, because Aldrich was older and had more of the pack's inherited memory, and something in that memory was telling him something about the man standing beside Mara that he didn't have the current information to fully interpret. "Who is this?" he asked. "My name," Cale said, "is Cale Ashvile. I imagine some part of your historical records has heard that name." The silence that followed was the silence of a person cross-referencing rapidly through everything they have ever known about their own territory's history, and arriving at a conclusion that restructures several things simultaneously. "That's not possible," Aldrich said. "It is improbable," Cale said. "It is not impossible." The next 3 hours were the most significant 3 hours Thornwood had experienced in living memory, and possibly in unliving memory as well. They talked in the pack house with the senior members of the current leadership, and Mara watched the room process the dual revelations, the return of Cale and the nature of her bloodline, with the helpless fascination of someone watching people discover that the foundation of the building they have been living in is made of different material than they were told. Elder Voss was there. He was very old now, genuinely old in the way that wolves sometimes aged when the wolf's constitution had been asked to carry a long life of compromised decisions. The kind of age that sat in the face as something more than years. He looked at Mara, and she looked at him, and between them was 6 years of forest, and 4 days of dried meat, and an expression that had tried for pity, and not quite managed it. "You knew," she said to him, quietly, without accusation, because it wasn't a question, and didn't need the temperature of accusation. "About my bloodline. About the seal." The old man looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected, which was that he closed his eyes and nodded. And when he opened his eyes, they were the eyes of someone who has spent a very long time being the wrong kind of person, and has run out of the energy required to continue being it. "Senna was my grandmother's teacher," he said. "The knowledge was passed down in fragments. We knew that a woman of the bloodline would eventually be born in our territory. We knew that the seal could be broken if she was placed in proximity to it. We did not know what the seal contained. We were told it was a dangerous old working, that proximity would dissolve it, that dissolution would be a danger. We believed that a woman without a wolf form was a safe tool because she would have no power of her own." He stopped. "I have lived 6 years with the knowledge that the information I acted on was incomplete, that the incomplete information was given to us deliberately to make tools of us, as it made a tool of you." Another stop. "I don't ask for forgiveness. I am telling you the shape of what was done." Mara sat with this for a moment. "The shape of what was done," she said, "is that a girl was expelled from her home on false pretenses by people who were themselves being manipulated by an agenda set 2 centuries ago. Yes. I have spent 6 years in a forest knowing that, and now I know more of its context." She looked at Voss steadily. "The question now is not whether we forgive each other, Elder. The question is what we do with the territory that remains. This is the moment where I ask you to share this video. Not just like and subscribe, though please do both of those things, but share it, because this conversation, this moment where an expelled woman sits in the room where she was judged and talks about what we do now rather than what was done, is the kind of moment that deserves to be in more people's ears. Share it, and then come back. What followed was not simple, because the things that follow moments like that one never are, because the revelations that restructure foundations require the people standing on those foundations to decide whether to rebuild or relocate. And in communities as old as Thornwood, the decision to rebuild is the harder and rarer and more necessary one. Mara and Kale spent 4 months in the territory, a fact that surprised both of them, though perhaps not the forest, which had its own way of knowing when things were taking the time they required. They did not take up residence in the pack house. They had a camp at the boundary that leaned toward their forest, that maintained the distinction between what they were rebuilding and what they had been building already, that kept the clearing and the herb garden and the fire as real things rather than things that had been folded into the pack's structures and made into history. Kale's conversations with the pack leadership were long and careful and frequently uncomfortable in the way that conversations about structural change always are, where the people being asked to change have to confront not only the practical questions of how, but the harder questions of why the previous structures were maintained when there were people pointing out the problems, why those people were removed rather than heard, why the shapes of the old oppressions persist so reliably across generations without anyone at their center believing themselves to be the villain. Mara's conversations were different in kind, and perhaps more important in impact. She talked to the members of the pack who were not leadership, the people who had watched her expulsion from the periphery of the gathered crowd, the people who had turned their backs because not turning was not yet an option they could imagine. She talked to the younger wolves who had grown up with the story of the wolfless girl as a cautionary tale, who had absorbed it as fact rather than politics. She talked to Petra. The conversation with Petra happened on a Tuesday morning in the pack's common garden, which was in the early stages of the season's replanting. And Petra was there with her hands in the soil, in a way that made Mara think they were more similar than she had let herself consider at 16. Petra looked up at her approach with an expression that was several things simultaneously: guilt and relief, and something more complicated, the expression of someone who has been rehearsing an apology for 6 years without being certain it would ever be deliverable. You don't have to say it, Mara said, sitting down across from her in the soil. I know what you were carrying. I do have to say it, Petra said. I've needed to say it for a long time. I was a coward. I knew it when I was doing it. There's no version of that where I was too young or too afraid, where the knowledge of what I was doing doesn't also live. And I have been living with it. Mara looked at her. She thought about 6 years of the forest and the fever and the circling creature in the night, and also the garden and the herbs in the mornings and Kale's gold eyes in the clearing. Thought about the whole shape of it, the whole texture of what had been built in the space of what had been taken. And she felt something happen in her chest that was not forgiveness in the transaction sense, not the absolution of a debt, but something more like the completion of a shape, the closing of something that had been open, the gentle settlement of a long-held weight. I know you were, she said, and you're not now. That's worth something. Petra put her face in her hands for a moment. When she raised it again, her eyes were bright. What are you going to do? She asked. You and him. Are you staying? Mara looked across the garden to where Kale was visible at the far edge of the common area, in conversation with 2 of the pack's younger members, the specific quality of his attention toward her that she could feel at this distance, the awareness that she understood was mutual and had always been mutual, the connection that the old magic had formalized, but that had been built through months of mornings and fires and the careful long work of 2 people deciding to trust each other. Not here, she said, but near. The forest is ours. We'll be near. The council that had maintained the structures of Senna's original working was not in Thornwood. It had never been in Thornwood. It was distributed, as such councils tend to be, across multiple packs and formal structures, maintaining its existence through the same patient-accumulated influence that Senna had pioneered, the same strategy of being present in institutions without being identified as the institution's governing intelligence. Kale knew this, and had spent months in careful conversation with Aldrich and the other pack alphas, who were either unaffiliated with the council or openly troubled by what they were now, understanding about their own structures' histories. The confrontation, when it came, was not dramatic in the sword and sorcery sense, though it was significant in the sense that matters, which is the sense of institutional power being named and therefore limited, of the thing that operates by not being seen clearly for the first time by enough people simultaneously to make continuing invisibility impossible. The 7 current members of the council were older wolves who had their influence and their positions and their long history of shaping decisions from the periphery of formal authority, and they were not accustomed to being in a room where the person across from them knew exactly what they were. Kyle was that person. 2 centuries of being the wolf had given him, among other things, an extraordinary patience with long games and a very clear eye for the difference between stated purposes and actual ones. He did not accuse them theatrically. He laid information on the table with the careful precision of someone who has been alive long enough to understand that truth is not a weapon, but a foundation, that the goal is not to destroy the opposition, but to build something different, something better, something that makes the opposition's function obsolete. Mara was in that room too, and she spoke twice, both times briefly, both times with the precision of someone who has had a long time to think about the specific mechanism of how ordinary people are turned against each other for the benefit of structures they're not permitted to see clearly. Her second contribution was the names of 23 wolves across 6 packs who had been expelled, marginalized, or quietly redirected away from positions of influence over the previous century, all of whom she had catalogued over months of conversation and correspondence, all of whom shared the characteristic of having asked questions the council found inconvenient, all of whom had been managed by the mechanism of making their asking of questions into evidence of unsuitability. The oldest member of the council looked at her when she finished and said, with the tone of someone attempting to assess a threat, "You are the bloodline girl. I am Mara Vance of Thornwood Pack," she said, "and of the forest beyond its boundaries, and of a bloodline that was used against its consent, and of a decision made freely in a clearing in winter that undid 2 centuries of your predecessor's work." She held his gaze, I am also the person who knows where 23 wolves are and what they experienced. And I am the person who is going to make sure that their experience becomes the reason the structures that produced it cannot produce it again. You can participate in that process, or you cannot participate in it. The process will happen either way. The oldest member of the council looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Kyle. Then he looked back at her. "You have his eyes," he said, which was not what she had expected. She blinked. "His manner," the old wolf clarified, and she understood he meant the Kale he had known from stories. The Kale of the histories, the alpha king who had refused to be bought, and wouldn't be intimidated, and was too right too often to be discredited. The directness, the habit of naming things clearly. He paused, and his expression was something she didn't have a complete name for, something that was perhaps the long weariness of a person who has spent their whole life maintaining a structure and has just been shown the structure's cost in terms that make continuation feel like a different kind of loss. My grandmother told me Kale Ashvale was the most inconvenient man she had ever encountered. "I imagine so," Mara said. "She also told me," the old wolf said more quietly, "that he was right." The next several months were the kind of work that doesn't make good story beats, but makes good civilizations. The slow, careful, detailed work of structural change, of the 7 packs coming together in a council of the sort that Kale had been trying to build before the sealing, representative rather than hierarchical, with the explicit mandate to manage the structures that had been identified as the mechanism of the council's influence, to formalize the protections that had never been formalized, to make it harder for any future group to operate as the original 7 had operated. Mara was part of this, not in a formal position at first, but in the position she had always been most effective in, which was the position of the person who pays the most attention in every room, who names the things no one else has named yet, who asks the questions that make the comfortable positions untenable. She was also in the hours outside those rooms, still herself, still Mara who talked to her plants and made her teas, and knew the forest like a second skin, who had her clearing and her garden and her very specifically built shelter against the granite outcropping that had kept her alive for 6 winters. Kale was in those hours too, in both his forms, in the easy parallel presence that had begun at a distance and had closed over months into something different. The proximity of 2 people who have decided to occupy the same space, not from need, but from choice, from the richer and more durable thing that is choosing what you could also choose not to have. On the evening of the first anniversary of the night, she had said, "I choose." This in the clearing. She was in her garden in the last of the autumn light, doing exactly what she had been doing on the morning the wolf appeared, harvesting feverfew and talking to it in a low murmur. When she heard the sound that was not the sound of a predator, the sound of weight on ground that had effort in it, and she turned from pure reflex memory, some deep body habit, and found the clearing empty, and then Kale was there, from the tree line, in his wolf form, walking toward her with the unhurried ease of someone who has nowhere else to be and nowhere he would rather be. And he crossed the clearing to her and stood in front of her with his gold eyes and the quality that had been there from the beginning, the look with centuries in it, and she put her hand against his face in the gesture she had made 1,000 times, and felt him lean into it the way he always did, and thought about the morning a year ago when she had not known what he was and had seen only a wolf in need of the arrow's removal, and thought about the morning a year before that when she had stood at the boundary stones alone and walked into a forest that would turn out to be his. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the 23. There are more. I think there are significantly more across the other territories if we looked at the records of the packs that formed after your time, the ones that have no ancestral memory of what those structures were built to replace." She paused, her hand warm against his face, his eyes warm against her. "We have a lot of work to do." He shifted, the clarification of form, the arrival, and he was standing before her with the same gold eyes in the human face. And he looked at her with everything that was in him, the centuries and the silence and the return and the clearing and all of it. And he said, "We do," and she smiled at him. The full smile, the rare one, the one she didn't spend carelessly. "Good," she said. "I've been Project. This is where we leave them. Not at the ending, but at the beginning of the real thing, which is always where the best love stories actually are. Not the moment of the first declaration, but the morning after, and the morning after that, the work done together, and the fire built by two sets of hands, and the years opened ahead of them like territory that is finally, genuinely, theirs. This is where we leave Mara, who was told she had no wolf, standing in her clearing with the evidence that she had always had something better, something the pack structures had no word for, the thing that runs through the bloodline like a river finding its own level, like a seal waiting for the specific key that was always going to come. This is where we leave Kale, who waited 2 centuries in the wolf and spent the first of his returned words on her name, standing in the clearing that became the heart of a different kind of territory, the territory that 2 people build when they decide to stop surviving and start choosing. If you are new to this channel, this story is what we do here. We make the love stories that don't end at the declaration. We make the love stories that reform the institutions and name the structures, and bring back the people who were sent away, and build the things that should have been built, that should have always been built, with the people who were always supposed to build them. Subscribe. Stay. We have so many more stories where this one came from, and every single one of them is waiting for you. Like this video if Mara's clarity wrecked you in the best possible way. Comment if Kale's patience made you feel things you weren't prepared for. Share it with the person who needed to hear that being expelled from the place that didn't know how to hold you is sometimes the beginning of finding the place that was always yours. The forest is always honest. It doesn't pretend. And it has been waiting all this time to be navigated by exactly the 2 people who know it best.